today what we're going to go through, as I mentioned, is really letting you know what's happened in the past year and where we're heading in the future. And I think the title of this slide is pretty important, in that this is about the building a decade of growth. We are now 10 years away from the achievement of the targets set out in the leadership statement that Minister Joyce produced back in 2010, 2011. And what you'll see is we're starting to get a pretty good foundation that can help us grow. So what I'm going to go through is just a quick overview of what we've achieved in the past year as an industry, and I think there's been a couple of key elements. One is that we're getting the messages out a lot clearer around the benefits of international education to New Zealand and its contribution to New Zealand. The easy one for many of us to think about is the economic impact. There is a number of students times the fees they generate, gives us a total, and also we know it creates jobs. But actually the long-term and more important benefits are actually those social and cultural connections. And one of the things we've noticed within the industry in the past year, and it continues to be a work in progress, is getting the stories out into New Zealand about that benefit that international students bring to the country. And so this is just a few examples of how we as an industry are starting to get that story out. And I'll talk a wee bit more about that later on, because I think it's a really important thing for us to focus on over the next year. I've referred to the leadership statement already, and one of the things that we've been doing is tracking the performance of all of us against that the goals that are in that leadership statement. So these are the current figures. They'll be announced over the next week through Stephen Joyce. In terms of Goal 1, which is around student attraction, for the calendar year 2014, enrolments were just over 110,000 students. So that's an increase of 13% from the 2013 number. And what you can see down the bottom is where that growth has come from. So primary schools are still struggling. Somewhat of an increase in secondary schools. Polytechnics did well. Universities continued to grow. But for the PTEs, excluding English language schools and the English language schools, you've seen a bit of a turnaround, which is a very good result, particularly for that part of the sector. What you've seen is growth has been driven by Indian students coming to New Zealand. That actually increased by 67%. So India, just as many of you know, India really took off last year, not without its issues, which need to be addressed and are being addressed. But that accounts for just over 8,000 students. China was up by 12%, and we also saw very strong increases out of places like the Philippines, and we'll talk about the Philippines a bit later as well. I talked about the growth being driven out of the PTE sector, including English language schools. That was about 9,000 additional students in that part of the sector, out of the total of about 13,000. And the polytechnics, the ITP sector, was up 15%. So some pretty good results. So that's all the sort of positive news. On the downside, what we did see was a continuation of some markets sliding. Markets such as South Korea continued to decline and is about in its fourth year of decline. Malaysia was declining as well. So there are a couple of pieces of work that need to be done about understanding those markets a bit more and understanding what it is we need to do. The second goal in the leadership statement is referred to as international delivery. So this is the export of education programs and services to other parts of the world for delivery overseas. And again, what we've seen is some good results, but it is quite early days. This is not an area that New Zealand has, from an education provider perspective, really focused on. Unlike other countries such as the United Kingdom and Australia, we don't do this very much at all. I think there's one university with a campus overseas, which is Victoria and Ho Chi Minh City. But what you see out of places like the United Kingdom is something like 52% of all of their international students are actually being taught in UK institutions outside of the UK. So they've had an investment program, as has Australia, for a number of years. But what we're starting to see is some good results in this area where a number of institutions are starting to think about that offshore delivery piece. Waikato Institute of Technology is one example where they are developing technical and vocational education and training in conjunction with the Chinese Ministry of Education for delivery at nominated institutions in China. And of course we've got the example of the relationships that a number of our universities have and are developing in Malaysia to provide foundation studies in Malaysia before they pathway down into New Zealand, which is also another really good example of international delivery. Also within this area are a number of non-traditional, I suppose, educational providers. So we do a lot of work with education publishers, and the work we've been doing with them is around taking their material that has historically been in books and how do they transfer that into digital. We also work with a number of education technology companies, which are at the moment very small. In New Zealand they're very small, but they're born global, and they actually don't look at New Zealand as a market. They're actually selling into the international markets already, and those are things such as platforms and content as well. So it's a pretty interesting and growing area. The third goal is how does New Zealand make the best possible use of its international education expertise? And this is, in the leadership statement, this has got a number of different components to it. One of them that is very significant is the internationalisation of New Zealanders, to help New Zealanders get a much better and deeper understanding of different cultures, different environments. And as part of that, 2 years ago, it was announced that we would run a Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia. That has been, as I say, going for 2 years now. We have had over 470 recipients of the Prime Minister's scholarships into Asia. It's $3.4 million has been invested in that area. And what we're finding is that this is a very powerful tool for us in terms of getting the messages about the quality of the New Zealand education system and the experience they can have coming from New Zealand students overseas that are overseas. The other thing, which was somewhat of a not a surprise, but we didn't know that it would happen quite so quickly, is how this is actually starting to help New Zealand students and New Zealand industry at the same time. So just one example was a student from Lincoln University, a guy called Cameron Massive. He got a Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia to go and extend his Mandarin training in China, which he did. Under the scholarship, he was also able to extend that and do that in Taiwan. Came back to China and got an internship on a dairy farm while continuing with his language studies. And he's just been employed by the Chinese distributor of the New Zealand branded ice cream Deep South. So what you're seeing is a New Zealand company getting the benefit of a New Zealander who actually understands and works and can communicate in these different communities. And as I said, this has happened a little bit faster than what we thought, and it was one of those things that you hope would happen and you think it's going to happen, but what we're starting to see is that's really starting to resonate. So that's a very powerful initiative under this goal. The other area that's very important in here is the linkages with alumni, and this is not the alumni that's associated with individual institutions, but actually how do we get a number of the international students to stay connected to New Zealand in some way. And if you think about the last 15 years, there's probably been more than 1 million students, international students, come through the New Zealand education system in one way or another. how do you keep those people connected? And in many cases, they want to contribute back to New Zealand and they want to remain part of New Zealand. So one of the initiatives that's been undertaken in the past year around that area is we've entered into a relationship with Kia. Many of you will be familiar with Kia. It was the Kiwi Expat Abroad group started by Sir Stephen Tyndall, and its initial intention was to keep the New Zealand diaspora that was out in the globe connected to New Zealand. They're extending that for those international students that have got had experience in New Zealand and want to remain connected. So again, that's got a number of benefits for us and the students, and for New Zealand. We do know that a lot of the former students want to contribute in some way, and it's not about money, it can be just about their time and engagement. So we've had alumni come and work with us on things such as ministerial and prime ministerial missions, where they act as hosts and they'll showcase what New Zealand education is all about. And also what it allows us to do is have another channel to get the message out about the quality of the New Zealand education system. So we're really excited about how we're going to pull that together. So those are the three main goals that sit within the leadership statement. I think the industry's really moved forward a long way over the last 12 months. But what about Otago region? So what we've got here is a pretty interesting snapshot. For the year ended 2014, the Otago region declined by 2%. Now, there's a couple of interesting things in this, and we need to dig a bit deeper. I don't think that these numbers take into account any institution that has an Auckland representation. So these are numbers of students that are actually in this region. Chinese students at the Polytech were up by 68%, so that's a very good result. Schools are really still having a tough time. So we're very keen in working with Dunedin, and there's already work underway, as you know from the various presentations over the last few months, around what's the international education strategy for this region to help it grow, because we believe the region's got a great opportunity and is a great place for international students to come to. Even saying that though, at 6% of the total, that's a contribution into the local economy of about $165 million. So that's still a very positive contribution, but how do we help make that even better? The other thing that's occurred over the last 12 months is the development, launch and implementation of the strategic roadmaps. A number of you in the room were involved in this, and this was quite an undertaking of getting the industry and different parts of the industry together to start thinking about how we start to operate together to get to the 2025 targets. That was quite a process, about a 9-month process, and a number of workshops and interviews. And it was launched in August of last year. Since that time, there have been about 9 initiatives across all sectors that have been undertaken. A few of these are very interesting from the industry's point of view. So a number of what are referred to as sector stories are being developed. So, excuse me, the universities have come together and are agreeing a concept of one message to go out about all New Zealand universities as part of the international marketing positioning for universities, and that's very positive. Polytechnics are doing that as well, and in fact getting to a point now where the concept is agreed and going into production around the collateral material and everything else, with the view of launching that in August this year at the annual conference as well. So that's moved along very fast, focused on professional and vocational education. and getting the message out, one message out to provide clarity around what it is in New Zealand. The third story that's being developed is around the school sector, again trying to get a common message out about what the school sector has to offer students, international students. So those are very positive developments. The other one with schools, which is very interesting as well, is that many of you are aware there's about 850 institutions in New Zealand involved in international education, the attraction of students in. Of that 850, 600 of them are schools. So it represents 2/3 of all of those that are participating in this industry, and previously did not have a centralised coordinating body to help organise, coordinate, develop, and in the last, since the launch of the roadmaps, one of the priorities for the school sector was the development of that body. So the establishment of schools International Education Business Association, which is known as CEBA, has been developed. The establishment board is in place, and they've got a number of initiatives underway around how they can pull together and coordinate across the school sector. The other part that these roadmaps did was not only prioritise the things that the industry needed to do, but also helped us get guidance on what were the priorities from a government perspective, what were the things that were most important for the industry on what the government needed to do. Part of that, and it came through very strongly, was continued alignment between the different agencies and departments and ministries that are involved in international education. And out of that, was the establishment of what's referred to as the International Education Senior Officials Group. This has got the chief executives and senior representatives from ourselves, immigration, business, innovation and employment, MOE, TEC, NZQA, a whole lot of other acronyms that are in there, but it's a very important group within the international education sector, and it's led by Stephen Joyce and Michael Woodhouse, who's the Minister of Immigration. That's been established, the work program is underway and being developed. And also that group will be at the conference as well in August, outlining what they're doing and how they're doing it, but more importantly wanting to hear back from the industry about what was important and where do the priorities sit. So again, I'll encourage you to come to the conference and just you'll have a chance to get access to those groups. So this has been a snapshot of the year. I think it's been a really good year. It's been a turnaround year, and I think there are some really good initiatives that have been started, but that's the beginning of the story. And part of that journey is about what we learnt. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Clive.
You can see from what Grant's outlined that it's actually been a really successful year, 2014. And I think one of the things that we're reflecting on at this point in time, after the roadmap process, the momentum that's been carried forward from that, the strong growth that we've seen out of 2014, is that there's not only great opportunity for the future of the international education industry, but there's actually great optimism as well around the fact that we can continue to build and grow a very successful industry. So that's the first reflection, and Grant hasn't mentioned it, but last year we did, as we do, an interim valuation. There's a valuation methodology for the industry, and that's looking like 2.85 billion, and we strongly suspect that when we go through an update of that later in the year, that will probably break that psychological $3 billion industry valuation mark. And I think that is, kind of a psychological barrier. It's $2.5 billion to $5 billion always seemed, it's doubling, it's a stretch. But actually getting to $3 billion, I think, starts to demonstrate and build confidence around the fact that mathematically anyway, as Grant said, a decade of growth, you can say, well, that's only 3% per annum, and we can actually get from where we are today close to $3 billion to a $5 billion industry. But of course, we should also be realistic about this as well. And one of the things that we'll all know is, looking backwards in particular, is that there hasn't been a 10-year period in the industry where we've just had 10 years of sustained growth. So we need to be realistic at the same time as we can be optimistic about things as well. And one of the things that you probably would have been reflecting on as Grant was talking at the beginning about where the growth came from in 2014, largely out of India and largely into the PTE sector in New Zealand, that actually that kind of diversification issue and the over-reliance on a small number of key markets is one of the things that we know causes you anxiety, and it causes us anxiety as well. And Grant's going to talk about how we might go about changing that reliance on a couple of key markets over the next decade. It's certainly not something that we're going to achieve overnight. And I've been saying over this series of roadshows to people, if we'd had this conversation 18 months ago, we probably would have been reflecting on over-reliance on a single key market being China. Here we are today, we'd probably reflect on over-reliance on two key markets, which is probably good news because we're no longer reliant just on China, but I think all of us would like to see over the next decade a far more diversified range of countries that will insulate us somewhat from invariably a whole range of events that are hard to predict into the future. The other thing that we're reflecting on and we see is, and you will know that I've talked about this before in Dunedin, is that there's been strong growth in some regions over that last 12-month period to the end of 2014. So regions like Auckland have been growing strongly. So I think Grant mentioned the average growth overall was 13%. Auckland's grew last year about 17%, Canterbury at 18%, but the growth is really uneven across the country. And what we want to do is to continue to work with regions like Otago, Canterbury, Wellington and Waikato, as well as Auckland, to make sure that the future growth that we get in the industry is spread across the country and it's not just concentrated in Auckland. So it's Auckland and Otago rather than Auckland or Otago. It's got to be about how does the whole country benefit and participate in this industry. So the other set of reflections around, what have we learned, what do we know around what's been happening in the last 12 months, moving away from the student attraction piece, the Goal 2 space, which is about that export of products and services offshore, that's still an area that collectively we don't know all that much about. And we need to do much more to actually understand what are the opportunities, the real opportunities for New Zealand in what is a very broad range of activity, and some of it from the outside doesn't necessarily appear to fit particularly well with New Zealand and the type of education system that we have. So just because the UK or Australia have got a huge transnational education industry doesn't mean that we should just copy that. We need to actually understand what are the best opportunities for New Zealand in that space. So there's a lot more work to do collectively to actually understand the various pieces of that and actually, as I said, where the best opportunities for New Zealand are. The other thing that we've been reflecting on is really around that Goal 3 space, which is around demonstrating the value of international education to New Zealanders here at home. And I borrowed this term from Grant the other day, but it's kind of that social license to operate thing. If we're going to create a decade of growth in the industry and increase both numbers of international students and the value significantly, we really need the support of the communities that we operate in to actually underpin that growth. And Grant's been making the point that in Australia, that social licence thing seems to be getting a bit disconnected at the moment. There's a lot of criticism being levelled at the international education industry of late in terms of some of their practices and some of their treatment of students. And we really need New Zealanders to actually be on board with the value of this industry, not just the economic value, but the cultural and social benefits, what international students bring to our country. Because if we are going to grow, we actually need our communities to be on board. And for most of you, if you're like me and you're talking to colleagues outside education and you talk about international education, we're a well-kept secret, international education. The success of this industry is a well-kept secret, and we've got to change that situation because New Zealanders need to know about the importance of international education and international students, and they need to be supportive of the role that international students have in building our future as a nation. So there's a lot of work to do in that space, and we need your help with that as well, because Grant's been saying this, we're paid to actually promote the industry and be enthusiastic and optimistic about it. And there's a certain sense from some audiences that we are paid to say that, so we wouldn't say anything else. So we really need you on board to actually be telling the story here in this region and locally in your communities, so that there's a much greater awareness of the industry, and it's no longer a well-kept secret. So again, not an overnight thing, but that's going to be really important to a successful future. And then lastly, 10 years of growth. Okay, we said, well, realistically, it's not going to be a smooth line. It's not just going to be 3% per annum over a decade. It's going to have some ups and downs. And there are going to be a lot of things that are going to affect us in some way that are very hard to predict, whether they are things like another global financial crisis or slowdowns in some of our key markets, the impact of technology on teaching and learning. There's a whole range of things in here. So we really need to, I suppose, operate in a way that both is diversified in terms of markets, but also as much as possible can adapt to changing market conditions, whatever they might be. And we've been actually very successful at that over the last 10 years, so pretty confident about that for the future, but just want to recognise that there's a lot of things that make the future very hard to predict, so there'll be a lot of hard work to do to achieve that growth. So I'm going to hand back to Grant now, who's going to talk about, well, what is ENZ going to focus on for the next 12 months? What are its key goals, and what are the key areas that it's going to focus on to support you to begin that next decade of growth? Thank you.
Thanks, Clive. So one of the things that we did, Clive's given some really interesting observations and insights as we went through the year and through the process about what is coming up for the industry. But it wasn't the only piece of input we had. We've of course got the Minister who is very engaged in this industry, very keen to see it be successful, and he has some very clear views on how he'd like to move things forward. We also use the priorities set in the roadmaps, and if I talk about roadmaps a lot, it's because for us it's an incredibly valuable and important piece. It helps us set our work programs around what's important for the industry. And they shouldn't be sort of static documents that we did them last August, so put them in the bottom drawer. We need to keep them alive because priorities change and market conditions change, and we need to make sure we use those effectively to help drive us forward. We also have a stakeholder advisory committee and a board that also gave us good input into our thinking. And then lastly, of course, individual discussions and catch-ups with different parts of the industry, with many of you in the room. The intelligence and the intel you have about how to do things really helps us start to think about our role in helping you guys succeed. So what we did was we've taken the view of the goals that are within the leadership statement, because those are the sort of the light on the hill for all of us, but actually put it through a number of lenses for Education New Zealand to think about what's the role we have in terms of our leadership, what's our role in terms of providing information for decision making, what is it that we need to be thinking about in terms of markets and programs, and lastly, what are the issues around capability to help us all achieve those goals. And that's at an industry level, but also internally for Education New Zealand, because as we move forward, you'll see there's some different skill sets that are needed to help us go to get to those targets. So goal one, as we've talked about before, is all about student attraction, and as Clive said, in terms of the valuation of $2.85 billion, $2.75 billion actually comes from the 110,000 students that come into New Zealand. So it's an incredibly valuable part, almost 100% of the value. of the industry. So it's an incredibly important part on how do we keep students interested in coming to New Zealand when there are a number of different options, not only countries, but learning styles, and we'll talk about that. So this remains our key focus. We believe, as Clive said, that the achievement of a $3 billion target in the next 12 months is achievable. That's a 5% growth in value. And what we're looking at is to increase total visa numbers by 5,000 or 4%. So there's a piece in there, as Clive said, that 2014 was a 13% growth rate. Why only 4? But as we talked about before, a lot of the growth came out of India. As I said, almost 70% of all growth came out of India. But associated with that speed of growth came a number of problems, particularly around quality of student issues, quality of provider issues, behaviour in market. There was a range of challenges, and that creates quite a risk for New Zealand, both in terms of our reputation internationally, but also, as Clive also talked about, across our communities. So there are a number of initiatives that Immigration New Zealand and New Zealand Qualification Authority is looking at implementing, and I think NZQA announced some changes to one of their rules last night that we believe is going to have quite a big impact on the Indian numbers. And just to give you a sense of the impact, it hasn't even been implemented yet, but I think word spreads in these areas. We've had 3 months of declining growth out of India, for the past sort of 18 months, I suppose. The February, March and April, or it might even be 4 months with May, has shown that year on year there's been a decline in those months. So that we're starting to see that, and as I said, that's where a lot of the growth came from last year. So we're saying about 4% growth over the next 12 months would be a good result. The other thing around that, and if we look through the lens of leadership, capability, intelligence and market and programs, around leadership we still see ourselves taking a lead role in the branding and marketing of New Zealand as an education destination. We also see we have a role at exploring and looking at where new markets for growth are as well. So we'll be focusing on that area. We do need to also make sure we provide much better intelligence and information to the industry to help with your decision making. One of the messages coming through is, where is all the intel? You know, how do we know where to go to? What are we going to do? And all the rest of it. And we recognise that that's a gap. We need to make sure that we are part of filling that gap. And so that's going to be a pretty important piece of work for us. And just on that market intelligence piece, we also would welcome getting input from you, because all of you are out in the market, you're hearing things, you're identifying opportunities and challenges. And if we understand that, that helps us start to direct our resources and what kind of information is needed for the industry. Around the capability in this area is less about industry capability, because I think we've got, as part of the industry, some extremely good international marketers. But what we have identified is that at that regional level, and Clive talked about it, is that there isn't a lot of knowledge or capability sitting in many of the regions that we talk to at council level, at economic development agency level, across a range of different groups. So we see there's quite a role for us to play in terms of helping improve some of the region's understanding of international education, what it needs, and what they should be helping the industry deliver. And as all of you in this room know, there's actually been some very good progress made in Dunedin around that type of work. We need to do that across other parts of New Zealand as well. And also in the last area, which is around markets and programs, is to think about what are the portfolio of markets that New Zealand needs to take off some of that dependency Clive talked about in India and China. Now, India and China remain very, very important to what we're doing as an industry and what our role is, but as Clive talked about, they can be quite volatile. and variable, and we've seen countries that both of those countries just sort of up and down over a number of years. We need to somehow build a much more sustainable model with those two markets, but more importantly, or as importantly, what are the other markets that need to be developed to try and build a bigger portfolio to reduce some of that risk? And that's around current opportunities, but also thinking about where future growth is coming from as well. So what we've done, and behind all of this is a very robust model that looks at macroeconomic data, changes in demographics, changes in income, as well as New Zealand's relationships with a number of these markets and where the government priority is. And we're referring to them as rebalance, promote and explore. So under the rebalance, there's a couple of pieces here. I've talked about China and India, that idea about how do we look at building a more sustainable engagement with China and India. We want to see growth out of those markets, but thinking about the sustainable model and where is the value coming from those markets. Also, what we need to do, and I talked about it earlier, is that there are a number of markets that are declining. Germany, South Korea, Malaysia and Chile, while not declining, is actually very dependent just on one program. And therefore, and from a New Zealand perspective and a New Zealand government perspective, we're investing quite a bit of money in those markets that keep on dropping. So there needs to be quite a detailed understanding about what's going on in those markets. Are we doing the right thing or the wrong thing, or is it just a market that has come to the end of its time and we need to sort of move on? Malaysia's a very interesting one, and I know there's quite a bit of work being done around developing new ideas and engagement in Malaysia, but Malaysia's very interesting in that it was one of our major source countries for many, many years. And what we're actually seeing now is it's one of our major competitors in many, many areas. And that's a really interesting change, because what we're starting to see is move from our historical competitors of the UK, Australia, Canada and the US into our non-traditional competitors. Malaysia is one, very good offering in terms of, for Indonesia, very good offerings for students out of China. You've got China also is not only a great source country for us, but I think depending on the material you read, at worst they're the number 3 biggest student attraction market going into China. And they've also starting to change their programs and policies around international education actually being delivered in China. So there's a range of things and pieces that we need to think about these markets that are changing, and how do we look at those in a bit more detail. We also identified markets that are currently growing rapidly, or historic markets where we've had some engagement but perhaps haven't invested as much as we could or should. So United States, Indonesia, Brazil, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam and Saudi Arabia are seen as key markets to promote in. And then what we are also saying is there's a number of markets out there that perhaps aren't quite ready yet, that we need to start exploring, but without it being so far out into the future that it loses relevancy. So I talked earlier about one of the fastest growing markets was the Philippines. The Philippines is very interesting market as well. That we do nothing in the Philippines. There is no marketing effort at all in the Philippines for international education. A number of providers go up there, but from a government perspective, and yet it's growing very rapidly, and we believe a lot of it's driven by the diaspora. That's actually the Filipino diaspora that's sitting in New Zealand. The question for us is, if that market's working, why does the government intervene? But also what we have to say is, if it did intervene, does that actually make it a bigger, deeper market? And is that where industry want to be developing? So that's quite interesting in that it's growing very fast at the moment. Colombia is also an interesting market. Latin America is seen as a key trading partner for the future. for New Zealand. If you listen to Minister Joyce, he talks about a Pacific Rim strategy where we've historically been going through the Asia route, and that will be incredibly important. But we also need to think about the right-hand side of that rim, and particularly Latin America and North America. So Colombia is a place of interest for the government. We're getting good student numbers out of there, but there is no New Zealand representation there. So there's no embassy, no New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. We're not there, so we need to start exploring that market. And Pakistan is it's not a new market, it's been around for a while, but it is a new market for New Zealand. And again, a very interesting piece with Pakistan, because we've been through this with Immigration New Zealand to make sure they're aware of what we're doing. And when we mentioned Pakistan, it would be fair to say they nearly fell off their seat. But for immigration, they are really looking at, rather than judging it on a country basis, actually taking a much more detailed look at what's in and what's out. So rather than just saying a complete no to everything.
Just a question.
Sure.
Nigeria is used quite a bit.
Yep.
As a growing market.
Yep. So Nigeria came up on our radar as well, as did a number of other countries out of Africa. But it was seen as too far into the future. This is a market we will probably bring into that explore area over the next couple of years. These were seen as the ones to do sort of here and now as we get this model moving. But Nigeria came up, and if you look at countries like Australia, Australia have a projection out, I think it's to 2025 as well. They've got about, in their top 15, I think they've got 6 countries out of Africa. And out of the top 15, I think they've got 9 that are Muslim countries as well. So the mix is really changing around demographics and regions. For the New Zealand government, Africa is important in terms of how do we build relationships with them, and our Minister for Foreign Affairs is looking at the program of engaging with parts of Africa. So it will come onto the radar. It's just not there for the next year, and probably, but within 3 it would be, is my guess. So goal 2, as I talked about, was international delivery. This is a really interesting area because, as I said, it's not an area of focus, has not been an area of focus for many New Zealand institutions, and it isn't for everyone anyway. And for Education New Zealand, it has not been an area of focus for us. We've been quite transactional in our engagement. One of the things we need to do is understand what is our role and what are the types of services and input we can have to help organisations in this area. So first step is actually develop what kind of services add value, but then secondly make sure that the industry is satisfied with those. It's a part of the industry that's valued at about 100 million New Zealand dollars. We believe it can grow to 150 million in the next 12 months. There is good growth coming out of that, but we also believe that there is a lot of international education being delivered overseas that isn't being captured in the figures, and we don't have all of the institutions that should be there in there. And to give you an example, one of the bigger providers of education and training are people like Airways Corporation around air traffic control, which they deliver out in market. And that's the type of thing we need to think about as we look in this area. And the other part of this is international students that are in a New Zealand provider overseas getting their education. At the moment it's about 3,200 and we believe that that can grow to 4,000. So in terms of the lenses we talked about previously, one of the things around leadership is this idea of transnational education is the term that normally captures a lot of this. We need to understand a lot more about what it is and what's New Zealand's proposition in this. What is the value to New Zealand and industry as well, and what are the different business models that are out there that are captured by this. So there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done around the thinking around what is the investment that needs to be, that could be made in this area. Attached to that is how do you assess this? And the Minister he's pretty keen on looking at this transnational education and getting New Zealand institutions out into the international marketplace. But he recognises that we need to take a very holistic view of risk and how we assess these things. So while an opportunity may be appropriate for an institution, if it's a wholly government-owned and government-funded opportunity, that actually is the government ends up being the lender of last resort. And if something goes wrong, they'll be called to fund the bailout. And secondly, it has a significant impact on our brand in those marketplaces. So it won't be Grant McPherson's company that's gone under, it's actually that New Zealand company has gone under. So we've got to really think about a much more holistic model to assess these opportunities. We also talked about capability in this one. This is a really different part of international education to marketing and promoting. And this requires a different set of skills. And what we've heard from industry is that those skills don't sit in abundance within the industry. And if they don't, how do we develop those, or where do we get those skills from? And attached to this is for Education New Zealand, have we got the right skills to actually help industry do this? And our assessment at the moment is we're pretty light in this area. So around that whole area of capability building needs to be quite carefully explored. We also need to provide much better intelligence on what is the international delivery models. We have seen, and many of you will see as you go around, you see Australian universities sitting in Kuala Lumpur or bricks and mortar actually in there. But what we're hearing about models such as franchising, licensing, virtual partnerships, there's a range of different business models and trends occurring. What we need to think about is how do we get that information out to you for input into how you're thinking of moving forward. And then the last piece around the programs and markets. One of the interesting things that impacts on this area and also Goal 1 is the impact of technology on what's happening. And you can see it's just accelerating at the moment in terms of the way things are delivered, in terms of the way students are learning. And also this area also links into that education technology group I referred to before, who are doing some quite amazing things. So there's quite a bit of work to do in this. And if you think about the goal in the leadership statement, this is actually far more challenging than Goal 1. Goal 1's challenging enough. This actually is to grow from $100 million to $500 million in the next 10 years. So that's a 5-fold increase in export revenues. So in terms of goals, this needs quite a bit of focus from us. Goal 3, working for New Zealand. I talked about this earlier. I think we've made some great inroads. I think the Prime Minister's Scholarship for Asia is working very well. I think there's some other opportunities around that, but not only for international education industry, we also need to link up with scholarships that are being offered by other government agencies. And many of you will be aware that Foreign Affairs and Trade have an aid program which is pretty well 100% education focused and bring in a number of international students. How do we start aligning those and sharing information and understanding what each other's doing in this area so that we can make a bigger impact in some of these key markets? And as Clive said, and I'll say it again, we need to tell this story in New Zealand. 3 years ago, just about every story was a very negative story, and even now it tends to be the bad news stories that get the publicity. We're seeing a much more balanced approach by New Zealand journalists, and you can see from that very first slide, we are getting some, we as an industry are getting some space in local press to try and explain a bit more about what the benefits are of having international connections and international students in the community. But this is an ongoing basis, an ongoing effort. And as Clive said, you will be a part of that, but actually the credibility comes from when industry talks about the benefits. And we encourage you to do that. We will help you and support you if you want to do that. But having you talk about this has a lot more benefit than us talking about it, or the minister. So those are the three goals of the leadership statement. The last goal for us is really around how do we continue to improve. I talked about before, we need to make sure we've got the right capability to help support the industry in the right areas. I also talked before about the importance of market intelligence and information provision to you. In both of those areas, we believe we're quite light, so we've got quite a bit of work to do in terms of making sure we build the right skills in our own organisation. So last slide is with the roadmaps that continue to help us drive the development of the industry, with the targets that we've set. The goal, of course, is to provide that, to build that sustainable, highly regarded, highly capable industry offering fantastic education and experiences to students of the world. And we're very keen to work together to drive towards that goal. We think that would be a great outcome over the next year, or at least be well on the way to getting there.